The biggest difference between our two main characters, Arthur Martin and Baya Banmamaud, is that the latter has the most unique name, while the former feels like one more Arthur Martin out of the 1,507 people in France with the same exact name. Politics is a theme that goes along with their lives, and even though they have a lot in common, so far, they have no idea of each other's existence. Arthur works at the Office of Epizootic Diseases, so he's in charge of monitoring the development of animal epidemics. Baya starts working for the same organization, but her role is much less important. She's a fellow call center operator. She's an extremely emotional and passionate activist, so during the first day, she overhears Arthur's talk in a studio and bursts inside to make a statement about the sick ways in which the head of the organization tries to pollute French society. She is finally taken away, and Arthur seems to only be amused by this sudden explosion. To get to know him better, in the next scene, we hear the story of his parents. Arthur tells his listeners that his mother, Annette, was saved by pacifists during the war and stayed with them until she got married. Her name was changed, and mathematics got to be his first and main occupation since it had the power to quiet her restless mind. She met Arthur's father, Lucien, at the university. On the screen, the man seems extremely old, but that is only because Arthur fails to imagine him young. So, there's nothing to be worried about. They got married soon after, decided to have no religion, and had a baby. They weren't a loving couple, however. They couldn't even negotiate the child's name properly. After some time, his father will go to Algeria as a part of the French military, and there, without knowing it, he will become the subject of Baya's parents' drawings. Baya's father, Mohammed, was still a child when he started painting everything he saw in war-stricken Algeria. This is why, as Baya says, he was severely Despite everything, however, he never complained about French during his lifetime, and Baya finds it extremely peculiar. By the time her father arrives in France, her mother, Cécile, is a hippie, so the alien war victim draws her immediately. She despises everything French, and so she's eager to get married and lose her name. And so, they start a colorful, strong family. Baya's living room has always been filled with people of different ethnicities and social backgrounds. Meanwhile, Arthur's house is never visited by anyone. All his parents are enthusiastic about new technologies. And while Baya's father is a painter, Arthur's old man has his own atomic power station. He is an extremely cautious man, and his caution is overdeveloped to the point of becoming a part of obsessive-compulsive disorder, so a nuclear plant in his hand poses no danger to society. At a very young age, Baya starts her first piano lessons with a man named Boyer. They never touch a piano, however, and this part of her life fills her with confusion and pain. She feels afraid to share it with her parents, however, so after they buy her a new piano, she pretends to know how to play. Her act is flimsy, of course, and as her parents get to know the truth, Mr. Boyer flees France to avoid demise or jail. The topic of Mr. Boyer was taboo in their family then. Compared to Arthur's family, where everything is taboo, this is the only topic they avoid touching. Arthur and Baya's adolescences are also quite different. Arthur is a bright kid, calmly and intelligently opposing important problems in French society, while Baya struggles with her sexuality a lot. She locks herself up at first in order to hide her problems with sex, but then she begins sleeping around irresponsibly for the same exact reason. Only once does Arthur decide to use his Jewish inheritance to get girls. Suddenly, after hearing that his grandparents were in Auschwitz, they became interested in him, and Arthur felt ashamed to use their name in that way. So, he decides to never do it again. He has the most ordinary name, and he intends to live as such. We fast forward to the present again now and see Arthur after firing Baya. He's trying to end things on a good note with her, but Baya was never interested in this job anyway, so she only half listens to him until, finally, she asks him to have a drink together. Over the table, they get to know each other. Baya finds out that Arthur isn't a right-winger, and this mere fact is enough to create a sense of gravity between them. Baya wants to talk about politics then, but as it seems, Arthur isn't much interested. He laughs anxiously to change the subject and brings up some documents to prove to Baya that epizootic diseases are serious things. Baya has a different plan than talking about epidemics, however. Suddenly, she offers him to go to her place, an offer that Arthur declines after a few seconds of confusion. Abashed, he says that he has a necropsy to conduct and that it cannot wait. It is unfortunate, since Baya only sleeps on first dates. He has one chance, and he misses it. Baya says goodbye and walks away, leaving Arthur arguing with his younger self. He always messed up with women, as the younger Arthur says. Despite some of his fortunate affairs, he never managed to give love a proper chance. Getting back home, Baya sees her father working on his newest piece. It is a dazzling painting, so Baya comes up with a great idea. She should throw an exhibition. The father is extremely reluctant, however. He refuses to be a happy individual, and Baya shouldn't try to turn him into one. She still tries to do it, however, and this is how the colorful piece of his father is placed next to Gauguin and Van Gogh. The man is still indifferent, though, and it drives Baya crazy. Meanwhile, Arthur is trying to connect with his mother. The latter has always been undercover in various taboos, so no wonder Arthur is eager to find out more about her. This is why he spends more time with her alone now, but the woman still prefers to remain in her shell. That night, the results of the presidential elections were announced in the news. The right-winger Chirac wins the elections, as it seems, and it is a dreadful surprise to Arthur. The next day, while voting, he runs into Bea once more. The latter is extremely upset. Everything about her expressions emanates sadness and doom. She embraces Arthur, who is the only familiar face here, and asks him to go with her. She doesn't want to be alone at this time. This is his second chance, so Arthur says yes. First, they go to a supermarket to buy some food. By the counter, Bea remembers one product that she seems to have forgotten, so she runs back to fetch it quickly. This small derailing, however, turns into a separate oddity, as Bea runs into a friend and completely forgets about Arthur. She runs back home to go to some event and receives a phone call reminding her of her other friend's birthday. In short, due to her rapidly shifting attention, she ends up completely forgetting Arthur. But the scale of her attention deficit is fully shown in the next scene, in which Arthur, still at the counter, sees her passing by in the street, completely. She seems to have forgotten to put on some clothes. He manages to catch up to her in the subway and helps her cover herself up. They go to her place then. Bea's extreme openness when it comes to sex turns Arthur into a shy college kid again. The sight of a naked woman seems to paralyze him. And so, when Bea understands that, she changes her approach. Instead of letting him undress her, she asks him to dress her up. Nuclear explosion. This is the first thing that will pop into Arthur's head every time he thinks about the first night with Bea. The morning after is a little confusing for him, however. He is woken up by a piano tune. Somebody is playing in the living room, and this somebody seems to act as if he's at home. Eric Bernard is his name, and as Arthur soon learns, he is Bea's boyfriend. He accepts everything she does, including sleeping with other men, but he finds it hard to endure her Arab blood. Suddenly, Arthur realizes that the notion of his younger self, that Bea might be the final destination of his love life, is absurd. And so, after Bea wakes up, he calmly and dryly bids her farewell and leaves the apartment. It is not long after, however, that Bea comes after him to explain her whole situation. Arthur doesn't want to hear about it, but she still goes on and on about how she sleeps with right-wing men to convert them. She chooses not to use her voice or speech to fight against her opponents. She uses her body. In Arthur's case, however, all is different. She actually likes him. It is on a subway train that she finally wins him back. Seeing an old couple creeping their way towards the open doors, she realizes they won't make it. And so, dashing forward, she makes a huge fuss, only to help this ancient couple. Arthur fails to resist the urge to kiss her right there. Something unexpected happens then. Bea gets married, but not to Arthur. The groom is an African-American man, completely new to her life. This isn't the only surprise Arthur has to deal with, however. After meeting Bea's parents, he is introduced to her sister, Radija. Cecile and Mohammed clearly want him to marry her, and Bea is peculiarly enthusiastic about this notion too. He won't even have to sleep with her. Cecile goes on and on about how everything will be arranged, and it is hilarious to see Arthur anxiously trying to say something back. All he can do is laugh in the end. Of course, he is not going to do it, but even the notion of arguing against this woman seems to be completely futile. Bea tries to justify her parents' behavior with their past. They were oppressed in a foreign country, but this justification doesn't work with Arthur. The notion of suffering victims of colonization is overestimated and too simplified for him. And furthermore, he might have had too much to drink, so he rudely demolishes her argument and pisses the bride off at her wedding. His younger self comes to him then and gives him great advice. To win her back and achieve complete victory in the argument, he should tell her about his Jewish family. He does so, but Bea's attitude remains unchanged. Despite her marriage, her relationship with Arthur stays the same too. One night, the latter receives a call from his father. Something in his family requires his immediate presence. So after the call, he hurriedly begins preparing. Bea expresses the will to tag along then. She wants to meet his parents, but Arthur tries to avoid that situation at any cost. He comes up with the most unfitting reason, suddenly pretending to remember his taekwondo class. The dinner with his parents is extremely boring, although in one instance, his father almost caught him sending Bea some inappropriate texts. He gets back to Bea, feeling especially excited to be close to her, but upon arrival, he is greeted by a young man, smiling broadly in his face. This is the kind of struggle he has to go through. The next day, we see an interesting picture in the park. On two separate benches, the young and present versions of Bea and Arthur are sitting. There is a major difference between them. While the young ones are speaking about their deep insecurities and troubles, the adults are trying to avoid such conversations by kissing each other passionately. In the next scene, we see both of them at a sort of neighborhood gathering. All are watching a debate on TV and arguing over the current political ecosystem of their country. Arthur doesn't take any of it seriously, though. He watches Bea get angry while arguing, and all he can do is smile and admire her passion. During that gathering, Bea identifies another fascist whom she wants to convert, so the next day, she goes out for a hunt. Arthur watches her for a while, but then another matter grasps his attention. His imaginary grandfather and grandmother are sitting beside him, urging him to talk more about his ancestors. There is nothing to be ashamed of in his blood. Arthur's younger self is here too, and he thinks the same. But still, Arthur chooses to come up with an excuse to leave his family story undercover. As it seems, Arthur himself has a very little idea of what his blood really is. He cannot even identify the language his ancestors were speaking. After the successful end of the hunt, he and Bea go back to his place, and the latter decides to become a little too playful in the elevator. She thinks nobody can see them, but very soon the door opens, and they are left with Arthur's mother, staring at them confusedly. It seems she was robbed, and now she needs to redo her papers. She needs Arthur's help with that. As they make their way towards the institution that handles such affairs, we understand why Arthur avoided Bea's meeting with his parents. He's ashamed not of Bea but of his parents. Annette manages to make one racist comment along the way, and upon arriving at the counter, she says that her birth certificate is lost. The lady behind the counter tells her that she cannot be of help. She needs proof that Annette is French, otherwise, since so many people cheat, she won't be able to redo her papers, and Arthur's mother will become an outlaw in her own country. The first one to get upset is Bea, of course, but Arthur asks her not to get involved in this. Soon, he will be the one exploding in anger. His outburst is so intimidating that the woman agrees to redo the papers, but Annette chooses to quit the entire process. She moves away slowly and exits the building. Arthur tells Bea more about his Jewish ancestry that evening. This news should sound gloomy, and the notion of the ancestors that suffered the immeasurably dreadful consequences of the Holocaust should sound sorrowful. But Bea explodes in happiness after hearing about this. She's glad that Arthur too comes from the background filled with oppression. To this light, the connection that they have seems much more beautiful. Arthur doesn't want to think about himself that way though. He prefers to consider himself a typical French man. Despite Arthur's opposition, they go to the wall of names to find his grandparents' names. He acts indifferent in the presence of Bea, but once she moves away to ask around, he suddenly gets invested in looking for them. The grandparents are calling to be remembered, and if their calling vanishes from the face of the earth without being heard, it will mean that the oppressors of the past will win. Within the course of the next days, Annette resumes working on her papers again. But some dramatical change is indubitably taking place inside her mind. Arthur and Bea prepare to go Arthur's parents' house in the next scene. They have to prepare mentally too. Anything that is even remotely connected to the Holocaust mustn't be spoken out loud. It is very important that Bea says nothing that can lead to such memories. During the dinner, however, she cannot help herself. A snowball effect takes place in which Bea gradually starts uttering words that more and more resemble the dark times of the Second World War. Consequently, Bea becomes extremely anxious. All her attempts end up futile. She just cannot say stuff that isn't connected to Holocaust, so she suddenly jumps up and excuses herself. In the kitchen, Arthur tries to help her calm down then, and after a short period of time, when Bea seems to be feeling much better, other visitors come into the house. It seems that Bea has invited her parents to come for the dessert without telling it to Arthur first. The table becomes much more tense then. It is obvious from the very beginning that the topic of discussion for the remaining of the evening will be war in Algeria. Arthur's father was serving as French unit there, while Bea's parents were on the other side of the conflict. There is no wonder that soon, the table explodes in argument. Arthur manages to come up with a very simple solution. However, deliberately, he ruins the coffee machine and asks Lucien to repair it. Naturally, Mohammed joins in to offer his hand, and soon the house fills with harmony. In the end, Bea fails to remain shackled by the taboos. She approaches Annette from behind and tells her the things that she must have been craving to hear for long. She tells her that she knows about her parents and about the trouble she must have gone through. They are definitely proud of Annette. The latter says nothing in return, so in this moment we cannot be sure whether these words hit the mark or not. After all the parents leave, Arthur and Bea engage in an argument about this last bit. But soon, this argument is cut short with yet another surprise of the day. A leftist politician and Arthur's idol, Jospin Lionel, appears at the door. Arthur is completely starstruck. It seems that Bea asked him to meet her boyfriend, Arthur. The mere fact that she called him a boyfriend is enough to make Arthur's day. The next morning is a colorful mishmash of the lasting effects of yesterday's positive experiences and heated political discussions. Despite this, however, Arthur is happy, and he wants Bea to know it. They go to see that day and spend some time they will always remember. Coming back to the city proves to be a tough thing for Arthur, however. Annette seems to be sick. Arthur visits her in the hospital in the next scene. As always, Arthur finds it extremely easy to come up with simple, technical subjects to talk about. But in the end, just before exiting through the door, he turns around and tells Annette that he wishes he would have known about his grandparents long ago. A new chapter in their relationship is open now. And suddenly, Annette starts telling him about a secret she's been holding on to throughout her entire life. She begins telling a story about a man in a taxi, but a nurse interrupts them, and the secret remains a secret. After hearing about this moment, Bea starts telling Arthur her secret too. She mentions the piano lessons she had in her early childhood, but Arthur moves away suddenly. He shows no interest in hearing the second part of the story and takes out a dusty old piano, asking her to play something. For a moment, Bea seems to reconsider telling him about the secret, but it's clear that she wants to finally let it out. She begins playing, and the secret seems to slip out of her mouth on its own. All Arthur wants now is to be able to give her as much as she's giving him. The next morning, he comes up with a plan and starts carrying it out. Firstly, he goes to Mohammed and tells him that all the paintings in his office were recently stolen. There are 30 marks on the walls, and they need to be covered, so he asks Mohammed to provide 30 paintings. Mohammed seems to have an enormous hole in his heart that he's been failing to fix. This is why he puts all his energy into compensating for all of that by fixing other stuff he can manage. And so, there is no wonder why he agrees to make 30 paintings. And so, this is how Bia's father throws himself at work. When Bia hears about this, she immediately understands why Arthur did it, and she runs to him. Meanwhile, Arthur receives some dreadful news. His mother has passed away due to constipation from sleeping pills. The news strikes Arthur extremely painfully. He looks around the pond, looking for help, and this is exactly the moment when Bea arrives at him, struggling to catch her breath. She has something very important to tell him, and this is how it goes: she loves him. Yet another story strikes Arthur's heart. At this point, he's completely numb. He has no power to tell her about his feelings in this moment, since all he can think about is how he's the reason for Annette's passing. He mentioned her parents that day, and it destroyed her. Arthur doesn't think it's only his fault, though. Bea stirred things up in the first place, so blame shifts onto her too. He wants her out of his life. He decides to start being much more careful when it comes to women. He starts meeting other safer potential partners shortly after, while Bea resumes her conversion. None of them seem to find any peace in their new lives, however. Arthur is the first one to get back to her. He calls her and asks her to meet him. A tide of enormous happiness goes over him when she says yes, but upon meeting her, this feeling flashes down from his face. Bea is now the wife of her most recent sexual partner. She's a Muslim, covered all in black. Arthur finds it impossible to grasp the meaning behind Bea's decision, and he seems to be unable to make her reconsider, so unfortunately, everything goes back to normal in his life. He immerses himself in his work then, trying to use all the means of precaution to avoid another epidemic. He visits a place that annihilates thousands of chickens all at once. The purpose of such buildings is to prevent epidemics, but Arthur finds himself unable to stay in that building for long. He runs away shortly after noticing the shadows of the past across the walls of this slaying machine of a building. From now on, he has no intention to live according to the principle of precaution anymore. In the next scene, he watches a talk show in which Bea speaks about her new book about her original theory of political change. She also announces that she has decided to quit putting this theory into practice in her own life. That evening, Arthur appears at Bea's book presentation. He approaches to have his book signed, and the connection between them is reset in just a few seconds conversation. We see a dramatic change in their story then. Bea gets pregnant and goes into labor just in time for Sarkozy to win the presidential elections. The latter isn't left-wing, so it is tough to determine whether Bea screams because of her intense physical pain or because of the dramatic political changes in France. Despite all of this, however, that day turns out to be the best day of their lives. They call their first child Chang and give him both of their names. Thanks to his parents' philosophy, Chang Martin Ben Mahmoud will be a foreigner to no culture.